Hey, it's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and bartonbrostudios.com, and in this tutorial you're going to learn how to draw the front view of the male head. Specifically, we're going to focus on the proportions of the head, its overall construction, and where and how to place the facial features in this particular view. Now, if you get some value out of this tutorial, I've actually got a full lesson over on howtodrawcomics.net and Skillshare that'll take you through the entire process through real-time demonstrations of how to draw both the male and female head up from the front, side, and 3/4 angles. Alright, that's it. Let's jump straight into this. To begin with, we're going to be drawing the front view of the male head. So I'm going to start out with a very lightly drawn circle. This circle will ultimately provide the foundation, the basis for the cranium of our head. This is a really great place to start when it comes to drawing the head because it gives you a visual representation of how large the head will be on the page, where it will be positioned, and even though we're just looking at a circle here, it actually holds a very important piece of information, which is exactly that, the placement and the size of the head. So if you are going to be drawing the head of a character in a comic book panel, that's something that you want to know, especially if you've got multiple characters in there. So just by the size of this circle alone and its positioning, we can work out where characters are going to be and how large they will be in comparison to one another or in relation to one another. Once we've got the circle drawn, it's time to establish the axes of the head. And because we're looking at the front view, an eye level representation of the front view, we're just going to place it straight through the top and out the bottom. Next, we will lay in the horizontal guideline that wraps around the belly of the sphere. Now try to make this as neat as you possibly can. Okay? Use a loose grip on your stylus, press down lightly, and in that way, when it comes to refining some of these lines, you'll be able to easily do that with a slightly darker outline that knocks all the light, roughly drawn lines back and makes them less noticeable. Once we've got the horizontal guideline drawn in, we'll lay in the vertical guideline, and this vertical guideline that runs from the top of the sphere to the bottom is going to represent the front of the face, the middle of the front of the face. So when we start to turn the head in space, this line that I've just laid in will actually indicate to us what direction the head is looking in. And so will the horizontal guideline as well, although that'll usually be showing us whether or not we're looking up at the head or looking down at the head. Next up, we are going to chop off the sides of our sphere. Now I'm just going to draw those in, but try to remember that ultimately the height of these side planes should equal 2/3 of the cranium's overall length. And the reason that I like to do this by eye is because sometimes when you're measuring this out to the exact specifications that it's supposed to be at according to the Loomis method, which this is actually based on, this construction method, I find that it just doesn't always lead to the best result. I think that in the end, although these methods can really help you out, you've got to develop your artistic intuition. You've got to develop your eye to know what looks good and what simply doesn't look good, what's not going to work. And one of the most difficult things about drawing the head in the front view is ensuring that it's symmetrical. So what I want you to do once you've drawn in these side planes is I want you to go ahead and just make sure that the center line here is actually situated in the middle. Okay, and I think mine is pretty spot on, so I'll leave it at that. I'm going to erase away these offcuts that are left from adding in the side planes. And then we'll continue on here. Now I'm going to drop the face down from the middle line to the chin. And I'm going to place it about here. Now keep in mind that if we're looking at the top 2/3 of the head, which you can find by simply drawing a line from one side of the side planes to the other, both at the bottom and the top. What we want to do when we're dropping down the face is essentially drop it down one more third. Now that is what the standard Loomis method would tell you. For me, I like to simply just drop it down as far as I think it needs to come. Now sometimes that changes. Sometimes I decide that I've either got to take the face back up to be higher, or I've got to make it even longer. And it depends on the kind of head that you ultimately want to draw and the stylistic representation of them that you want to have within your work. So just keep that in mind, that if you find that your heads are just either too long or too squashed looking, then keep the 2/3 in mind at the top, drop it down one more third to really nail that correct measurement. And then once you've got that sorted, simply go ahead and start to, you know, push it, bend the rules to get the desired result that you're after. But this is the way in which I normally work. I don't bother measuring out the thirds. I just try to drop it down to what I think it's going to be, and then I draw in the jawline. Now, to draw in the jawline, what I'm first going to do is create a middle or a vertical guideline that runs down the middle of these side planes. And that'll show me where the sides of the head would be. And remember that when we're looking at the head from the front, the reason that we're able to see a foreshortened representation of those side planes is because, well, the face is actually narrower than the back of the head. So we get this very foreshortened, put in perspective visual of those side planes. Of course, because we know that the jawline actually comes back to sit at the middle of the side view of the head, we need to know where the middle of the side view is going to be in order to draw in the jawline. So once I've got that placed in, I'm going to drop the jawline down. And remember that because we're drawing a male head here, this is where one of the key considerations are going to need to be kept in mind in order to actually make it look like a masculine jawline. And the first key consideration is to ensure that the corners of the jaw are just that little bit sharper, that little more chiseled and square than they would be on a female character. And so rather than rounding it out, we're going to leave it quite sharp. Okay, so we've got a reasonably sharp corner there. If we wanted to make this head look more meatheadish, like a buff dude or a Hulk-looking character, then we might actually bring the jawline out so that it's it's the opposite of tapered. It actually widens at the corners. Now I don't want that. I actually want a character that looks, I guess you could say, it would be the standard for a male character rather than a big buff meathead looking brute. So this will do. Once I've got the corners of the jaw established, which you'll notice almost aligns with the bottom of the sphere there that we initially laid in, I'm going to bring the jawline down to the chin. Now keep in mind that one of the other major distinctions between male and female heads is going to be the broadness or the wideness of the chin. And for a male head, we do want to keep that fairly broad. We'll do the same thing on the opposite side of the face. Now you'll notice that I'm adding a little bit of extra shape to the bottom edge of the jaw that I'm drawing in here. And that's just to give it some character. Now, again, I think that the length to which I've drawn the face down to, I think that it's working really well and that it looks pretty good. But keep in mind that there are times when I start adding in the facial features and I simply think that it ends up looking too long or too short, and I will customize it. I will change it up. So that's why it's important to always make sure that when you're working, especially at this foundational stage, keep it light, keep it loose, and know that everything is subject to change. That's the point as to why we're coming up with these foundations. They're supposed to be the rough blueprint. Sometimes that blueprint is going to be a little bit off and you'll need to make corrections. So don't always stick to the blueprint if it's simply not working. Okay, great. So we've got the jawline laid in. We've got the cranium established, and that, on a very basic level, completes the general shape of our head. Now it's time to plot out where the facial features are going to be. Now, if we take the distance between the brow line and the chin, and then we divide it in half, that's where we're going to find the nose. And I like to make sure that I'm making those connections throughout the face. I'm making those associations so that when I start to turn the head in space and represent it on a different angle, even though it's going to be foreshortened, finding the positioning of the nose is still fairly easy because I go, okay, well, I know that it just sits between the jaw and the chin. And so even when it's foreshortened, that's going to be an easy anchor point to establish. Next up, when we're looking at the distance between the nose and the chin, we're able to find the mouth by dividing that space up into thirds. So I'm going to add a line here. I'm going to add a line there. Now you'll notice that those thirds aren't equal, so I'm going to undo that. Right? I'm not just going to leave them there. I'm going to actually make some corrections. I don't usually get this right first time around. Sometimes I've got to do the wrong thing in order to do the right thing. So also be sure to keep that in mind, that, be very, very careful to get these proportions correct. Do not skimp on the amount of attention and time that you give to doing so, and you'll find that you're able to, get a head that looks correct, that looks accurate. So certainly take the time to make sure that those thirds are equal, and that, the nose really is placed in between the brow line and the chin. Okay, so we've got our thirds placed in there, and I still think actually that I could raise that top third up a little bit more. And remember, even though we're making these measurements, if in the end the mouth looks like it's sitting too high or the nose looks like it's sitting too low, I'm going to make the adjustments that I need to make in order to make it look correct. Okay, wonderful. So we've got the nose figured out. We've got the mouth placed in there. Next up, it's time to lay in the ears. Now remember that it's the top third, by the way, in this area below the nose that we are going to be placing the mouth. Okay, so let's get those ears drawn in. Now the ears are quite simple. We can just go for a very general shape here. And the key things to keep in mind is that the top of the ear will align with the brow, and the bottom of the ear will drop down to the nose. And that'll give us the full length of the ear. Now, as far as the width of the ear, well, that, in a very similar way to the side planes, is going to be a foreshortened representation of the general ear shape, because they do angle outwards somewhat. So we're still able to see the interior ear anatomy even in the front view. It's just very, very squashed and very, very skewed in comparison to when we're observing the ear in the side view. Okay, great. So we've got most of our facial features figured out as far as where they're going to go. The final facial feature, in fact, that we need to place in is a very, very important one. It is, of course, the eyes. Now, the eyes are going to sit right in the middle of the head. Again, another very easy way to figure out where they're supposed to sit. So if we take the top of the head and we take the bottom of the chin and then we divide it in half, which I believe that it'd be about here, this is where our eyes are going to be placed. Okay, just underneath the brow line. Now, again, depending on your style, those eyes may sit a little bit higher, they may sit a little bit lower. It really is completely up to you. You think about an anime head, for example, or a manga head, and you'll notice that their proportions detour far away from what we're covering here in the Loomis method. And so, stylistically, those proportions and the shapes that you pick for your characters, it's completely up to you. Start with this if it's all you've got, for sure. Use it as a base, but then branch out and really make this method your own. Next up, what I'm going to do is place in the hairline. Now the hairline will run from the top of one side plane to the other, right across the head. You'll notice that my side planes aren't completely level, so, you know, make them level if you need to. I'm just going to draw it straight across and pretend that they're level. There we go. See, I don't get it perfect, and that's completely fine. That is just the nature of being a comic book artist, I think. That's the conclusion I've come to, because nothing really works out 100% of the time. All right, once we have got the hairline placed in, let's draw in the neck. Now, this is another key difference between men and women, is that men will typically have a little more muscle mass around their neck, especially a fit man, simply because that's the way that their bodies are designed. So we'll draw in the neck here, and they've also got larger trapezius muscles as well. So the trapezius muscle, usually I look at the midway point of the bottom edge of the jaw, and I know that if I draw a line down like so from that point, that's usually where the trapezius muscles are going to begin. Now this is a heads workshop, not a neck workshop, so I'm only going to be showing you, minimally what you need to think about when it comes to drawing in the neck. But I do think that the neck is still very important for heads because it can change the vibe of the head very much so, especially when it comes to drawing men and women. Now, keep in mind, of course, there are different representations of the head beyond just male and female. You've got a lot in between. You've got younger looking people. You got people of different genders and different sexes and whatnot. And there's a large variety of different sorts of heads that you can work with. So keep in mind that all of these proportions and all of these head shapes, you can change to suit your needs. We don't have time to cover all of them, of course, but the idea is to give you the standard ones so that you can, push and pull those basic measurements that we've come up with here to create something which is more unique. Okay, so we've got our basic head foundation established now. And by the way, in the later lessons of the workshop, what I'll be showing you is how to throw all of this out the window and completely customize the head in order to come up with something very different. So, but yeah, we need to know what the standard defaults are to begin with in order to give us a place to start. Once we've got the foundational head generally drawn in, it's time to establish the facial planes or the head planes. Now, I'm doing this on a very basic and simple level, okay? Not to the degree where you would be able to, I guess, light the head effectively. I mostly do this to just get a fairly simplified understanding of what the head's geometry consists of so that I can just turn it in space a little bit easier, figure out where the face will sit in comparison to the side of the head and that kind of thing. It helps me to be able to turn it around inside 3D space mentally, inside my mind, so that I can project it down on a page a little bit easier. Okay, so I'll place in the side planes of the face now, and this division actually separates the front of the face from the side of the jaw there. And once I've added these in, again, you can see now where the face area of our character is going to be thanks to these planes. And this becomes especially important because later on when we start to view the head from above or below, what's going to happen is that we're going to see this general area where the face is going to be. Let me shade it in very roughly for you. We're going to see how that starts to foreshorten, how it starts to shrink or stretch, depending on the foreshortening that's applied to it and the viewpoint representation that we're going to be presenting it on. Wonderful. So this completes our foundational head model, planes and all. Next up, let's go ahead and actually draw in the facial features. So I'm going to start with the eyes. I always like to start with the eyes because they are the windows into the soul, and so because we pay the most attention to them, they intrinsically tend to have more importance placed upon them, even for us artists. So for male eyes, I tend to keep them fairly small, actually, and that is a stylistic choice. You know, I'm a bit of a 90s fan of comic books, and if you think about artists like Rob Liefeld or Mark Silvestri, you may or may not be familiar with their work. They used to draw very small eyes for their characters that were set far apart. Um, so I'm going to go ahead, draw out some small eyes. Something like this will work well. And I'm just going to start out with the outline. Now, as I said before, if you do nothing else, in order to practice drawing eyes, simply use this shape and draw it over and over and over again. Okay, we've got a line here for the inner eye, a line here for the outer eye. We've got a line for the top, slightly curved, and when we've got a line for the bottom of the eye opening. See that it kind of curves up and around to the duct. Now, that basically consists of 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. So just practice that basic shape. And what you can do once you've got that shape down is you can very easily start, placing in some darker lines around it, some eyelashes, in order to bring more attention to the eye and embolden it and really bring it through to completion. But even with my male characters, I like to indicate some eyelashes, and it really depends on the distance to which you're looking at the head. Sometimes you'll find that you're just going to darken up the outline rather than actually define individual eyelashes, simply because you may not see them from a distance. I'm going to go over the top of the eye that I've drawn up here, just real quick to show you, how it might look when completed. And I'm refining the shape here, of course, as I go over the top of it, just to really polish it up. But that's about as the amount of additional definition that I would give it. So let's do the same thing to the opposite side of the face. We'll lay an eye in here. And it's going to be an exact mirror representation of what we drew up on the left-hand side of the face. So we'll get the opening generally drawn in using our 4-line, very basic shape that we've been learning about. Again, I just love this simplifying it down because it makes it so much more easy. And because it's you're thinking about it in a very non-complex way, it makes the whole drawing experience so much more enjoyable. Because all of a sudden you're not overwhelmed, you're not really overthinking anything, and you're not guessing. I think having to guess, leaving this stuff up to chance every time you put pencil to paper, it can be a real problem. It can be discouraging because you don't always get a consistent outcome from doing that. So what we're trying to create for ourselves is a default library for the facial features, and of course the fundamental head structure itself, so that we can focus on the more creative aspects later on of what goes into a memorable looking face. Okay, so we've got our other eye opening placed down there now, and I'm going to, just as with the other one, embolden it a little bit, indicate some subtle eyelashes on the sides. And now keep in mind, if you do thicken up the eyelashes on your male characters, they'll tend to look a little bit more feminine. That's completely fine if that's what you're going for. In fact, sometimes you can add thicker eyelashes or darkened eye outlines to villain characters, male or female, and that will tend to work pretty well actually. For some reason, I've found it does anyway. You think of Jafar from Aladdin, for example. Okay, cool. So we've got the eye opening placed in. Now let's go ahead and draw in. I'm going to, yeah, okay, let's go ahead and draw in the pupil and the iris. I was going to leave that till later, but I think we can draw it in now. So I'm going to start out with the iris. I'm going to very lightly just sketch that in there. And then I'll lay in the pupil. And what else I can add to the pupil is a reflection within the eye. And that reflection, or that specular highlight, will give the eye a wet look to it, which the eyeball tends to have. Now, you certainly don't want dry eyes, because that will make them hurt. So we'll do that for both eyes. And again, one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the front view of the head is just maintaining that symmetry, not just within the shape of the face, but also the placement of the facial features and their shape. Now, usually what you're going to find is that you want to have an eye width between each of the eyes. And so looking at mine, they're probably set a little too far apart. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to erase this one and I'm going to move it in. And the reason that I'm taking the time to erase it rather than just making a selection around it and moving it inward is because I want to show you that it's actually not that much of a big deal to just redraw something in there and correct it. It's totally fine. It's certainly worth going back and correcting things if you see they need correcting. Don't ever just leave it, because if you just leave it, you'll lose out on a very valuable lesson. But even more than that, the outcome of your work, well, in my opinion, it's only as good as its worst aspect. And so, and the reason I say that is for your sake, because you'll always be able to see the mistakes within your work, even if other people don't. And so make sure that you fix them. Otherwise, they'll always be there when you look at it. At least that's my philosophy. So, I'm sure you can relate with it as well. I know that one of the worst things in the world is when I go back to an old piece of artwork and it's, I knew that I could have done better, but I didn't. I was lazy. Never be lazy with your work. Value the fact that you're able to do something that most people can't do very well, which is actually draw, especially faces in this case. Okay, we've got that shape drawn in there for the eye. We'll redraw back in the iris and the pupil. Little reflection. And see that really took no time at all. Now, you also want about an eye width between the eyes and the ear, or the outer ear as well. At least that's the way in which I like to measure it. But sooner or later, you won't need to really measure anything because you'll just lay it down on the page. It'll either look right or it won't. Next up, what we're going to do is draw in the eyebrow. Now, the eyebrow, like the eye, is made up of four sides, essentially, maybe with a fifth corner. But what you'll notice is that on men, typically the eyebrows will be set down lower on top of the eyes, and they'll also be a bit thicker. So what I'm going to do is start off by drawing in the bottom edge of the eyebrow, taking it down from the actual initially established eyebrow guideline, setting it closer to the top of the eye. And then I'll draw in the top edge and the outer edge. Once again, if we go over here to the side and do an example of the eyebrow, if you just practice this shape alone, you'll get used to its general structure. You'll notice that even though it's four sides, those sides are actually quite curved, while the edges or the corners are left very sharp, rather. Okay, so that's the shape that you want to practice. That's the shape that you want to capture as accurately as possible, because It all really comes down to shape, ultimately. As far as the solidity of your drawing and how good it's actually going to look, everything is really dependent on shape. If you capture a good shape, it doesn't matter what you add into the interior of that particular element. It'll look good. You think about those more simplified styles that really don't have a whole lot of rendering applied to them or anything like that. Again, manga would be a really good example. Um, you know, I mean, you even get very complex styles of manga, of course, but you get what I mean. Like sometimes it's just the silhouette alone that really makes a piece look amazing. So we'll do the same thing on the other side of the face, drawing in that eyebrow, setting it very low down to the eye. And I'm also adding in that additional corner on the bottom edge, just to finesse the shape a bit. I'm going over the top of the outline of the eyebrow here to define its shape with a further amount of vividness. And then after I've done that, I'm going to start placing in some eyebrow rendering. Now this eyebrow rendering is going to represent the clumps of eyebrow fur on the eye, give it some texture and some additional, I guess you could say, value, because the rendering that we'll be placing in here will actually darken the tone of the eyebrow to an extent. Now, because we're dealing with hair, essentially, we want to make sure that we make it look as natural as possible. And the way in which I do that is I try to ensure that these render lines aren't too uniform, that some of them are sitting close together and some of them are sitting close apart. Now, or rather, close together and far apart. So, I'm trying to mix up the amount of distance that I'm placing between them, and generally I'm grouping some of these lines together or separating others. The idea is that we want to also, as far as their direction is concerned, comb the eyebrow rendering back into the direction that the hair is supposed to be flowing in. Okay, so you'll notice that I'm actually combing it back toward the end of the eyebrow. There we go. Wonderful. So we've got our eyebrows drawn in there. Next up, let's go ahead and place in the nose. Now, I like to drop the bottom of the nose just below the nose guideline that we've placed in, rather than sitting it right on top. So usually I'll start out with a very simple line on the dark side of the nose. To say that my light source is coming from the top left, well, that would cast a shadow on the bulb of the nose, so that is what I'm representing here with this single line. And again, I'm dropping it just below the point at which I established the positioning of the nose initially. Next up, I'll draw in a nostril. That nostril will look a little bit like this. Nostril opening. And then I'll leave it at that. Then I'll place in the other nostril on the dark side of the tip of the nose. And that's really as complex as I make the base of the nose. This is where most of the detail, most of the articulation of the nose is going to come into play. So over here to my left-hand side of the head, if I was to draw out the base of the nose, here's the most simple way of doing that. The openings on either side. Now, if the light direction is coming from the top right instead, well, I would simply place this contour, this line, on the opposite side of the nose. So it would start here. I'd draw in the nostril opening on the light side. I draw in the nostril opening on the dark side. Okay, because what's actually happening in this area is we're getting a slight shadow or contour being created from the bulb of the nose, which anatomically it looks a bit like that as far as the underlying cartilage is concerned. Again, just something to keep in mind, which will help you to draw the nose accurately. It's a very stylized looking nose, of course. You may have your own way of drawing noses that works for you, that captures the look you're after. You don't necessarily have to draw in my style, but I am showing you how I execute it for sure. Next up, what I do is I add in a little bit of an indentation around the top of the bulb of the nose, like so. And I'll also add in another one on the opposite side, just to indicate on an extremely subtle level the anatomy that's happening within that region of the face. And then I'm going to start to add some subtle rendering around the eyes and the brow where it leads into the top of the nose. Okay, so I'm going to drop a line down from the underside of the brow, which intersects with the front of the eye and the inner area. And I'll do that on both sides. I like to tackle both sides simultaneously because again, we want to maintain that symmetry. And if I do something on this side, I want to do it as soon as possible on the opposite side so that I don't forget. All right, and I'll add in some subtle, I like to double up my lines sometimes, and all that really means is if I lay in one line, I may lay in another line right next to it just to give an appearance of thickness. You'll notice that I did that with the indentations of the nose on the dark side. Again, it's just one line and then another line just to create an indented appearance or a look of thickness to a single contour. Next up, I'm going to indicate the eye sockets by drawing a very light and subtle line. Now, this is an extremely light line. Keep that in mind. I'm barely touching the stylus as I draw that in, but it is enough to indicate an indentation within the form. Okay, great. And, I may add in a subtle line here as well. One that's not doubled up just to indicate the eye socket on that side. And that's really all that you need to add in to the male face. Now, if this was an older looking character or one that was a little bit more chiseled, or, sometimes if you add too much detail to a face, it can actually cause it to look, you could almost say unattractive, or disturbing in some cases. So a lot of the time with monsters, for example, or villains, you'll notice that they have a ton of detail added into their face. And so, I try to keep it as subtle as I can. Now, for somebody who loves rendering as much as I do, that can be tough sometimes, and I often find that I overdo it, which is why I intentionally try to hold back as much as possible. Wonderful. Now that we've got the nose and the eyes drawn in there, let's place in the opening of the mouth. And what's so cool is because we've already plotted out the placement of these facial features, we really don't have to think about it. There's no guesswork that goes into it anymore. We've figured it out. And so now we can completely focus all our brain power on just drawing the facial features accurately rather than trying to figure out the proportions of the head and, where they need to be positioned. And we freed up mental RAM by putting in the planning first. Right, so we've got our mouth opening here, and I'm just going to start from the middle, lead it out into the corners of the mouth. Now, I should mention that the width of the nose is going to be about one eye width as well, so it's going to sit directly between the eyes. And as far as the length of the mouth, well, I like to bring the corners out to line up just short of the middle of the eye. Okay, and I'm going to do that on both sides. So it almost lines up with the pupil and the iris, or the middle of the eye. So if I was to draw this up over here to the side of my head, again, I start out with the middle of the mouth, which has a little dip in it, right in the middle of the top lip. And I draw out the corners, Or I draw out the rest of the mouth, leading them into the corners. And this actually determines the shape of the mouth, the trajectory of its opening. So sometimes it can be sad, sometimes it can be happy, and ultimately this contour here is going to represent that either or. Once I've got the opening of the mouth drawn in, I can start to draw in the outline of the lips, and I'll do it up here in this larger example just so that you can see it more clearly. Usually I add in a little indication of the top lip outline right at the top in the middle, and then I'll add in slight outline, indication of the lips outline toward the corners of the mouth. And then I'll place in a much darker outline for the base of the bottom lip. And that's because a lot of shadow tends to collect underneath the bottom lip as it leads into the underside plane of the mouth muzzle, which ultimately connects onto the top of the chin. And sometimes you may add in, once again, a little bit of an indication to the outline of the bottom lip around the sides. But I really don't make it any more complex than that, or defined than that, especially on a male character. Because again, defining the lips is more of a feminine attribute that you would add into your female heads because, women tend to wear makeup, such as lipstick, such as mascara, which is, and the reason, by the way, for them doing that is to accentuate those facial features, the most expressive facial features on the face. Okay? And so it's actually a really good thing to add in there if you want to draw attention to the features of your female characters. For our dudes, though, we really don't want to focus on that. We want to focus more on shape than anything else. So I'm going to add a little indentation up here at the very top of the mouth. I'm going to darken up the corners of the mouth opening and lead the outline of the top lip down into those corners. We'll do the same thing on either side. And then we'll place in that nice dark outline into the bottom lip. And we can add in some rendering directly underneath it, just to show that indeed the anatomy within that area does recede into the top of the chin. And now I'll place in a subtle indication of the bottom lip outline. Just about does it. Great. Next up, let's draw in the anatomy of the ear. Just going to outline the shape of the ear a little bit more. And I'm going to basically just copy what you see me doing here to begin with, because when we jump into the facial features lesson, I'll be going over the ear anatomy in much, much more detail. For now, I'm inviting you to learn it in the same way that I learned it, which is just to copy what you see and redo that many times over, as simple as that sounds. So we start out with the outline, with the outside shape of the ear. And then we've got some interior anatomy going on. And one of the first areas that you're going to see when it comes to observing the anatomy of the ear is this. It's almost like the inner frame of the outside shape of the ear that you're placing in, which actually leads into a Y-shaped piece of cartilage. And in this view, that's going to be extremely foreshortened. Now we'll get a better look at the interior anatomy of the ear in the side view, most definitely. But for now, we're going to be looking at a very skewed, very squashed appearance for the ear anatomy. So next up, we've got this other line that completes the Y-shaped piece of cartilage, which will lead up into the ear opening cover. And then we've got the ear hole that actually sits just underneath it. And then the reason that this is a Y-shaped piece of cartilage is because it's got a little indentation in the top, a little dip that will articulate there as well. Great. Next up, let's do the same thing on the opposite ear. So you kind of get extra bang for your buck when you're drawing the front view of the head because you're doing everything twice over. You're drawing the eye twice over, you're drawing the nostrils twice over, and the ears twice over. So we'll start out with the basic ear shape, and then we'll draw in that interior frame, which partially makes up the Y-shaped piece of cartilage, leads down into the earlobe, and then we've got the interior of the Y-shaped piece of cartilage. We'll draw that down into the ear opening. There's a few bumps along the way, of course, that we want to add in there too. You know, the ear is a very organic looking, strange piece of anatomy that we're adding to the head, probably the most complex of them all, but also one of the less observed facial features, which is why the eyes and the mouth, even though they're fairly easy to draw, can be quite difficult to capture completely accurately sometimes just because they're put under so much scrutiny. Whereas if you draw a wacky looking ear, as long as it looks semi-right, no one's necessarily going to notice. Wonderful. So this completes the facial features on the head. Now what I'm going to do to really wrap this up and polish the presentation is I'm going to go around the outside of the head and just make sure that that shape is solidified. So I'm going to so I'm just going to darken up the outline essentially and refine it. One of the things that I like to do is actually bring in these side planes and curve them inward just a little bit behind the ears. Otherwise, I find that, you know, the top of the head just looks a bit too arched. It looks less like a skull when it's just coming straight out of the top of the ears like that. So I like to curve it inward at the base where it meets the ears. Then we'll go around the top of the skull, trying to give that a nice curved, neat looking appearance. And you'll notice that the darker we get with that final outline, and you'll notice it's still a very thin outline, it's just a little bit darker now. The more those looser foundational lines end up being less noticeable. They're pushed back visually. And this is kind of what happens when it comes to the outline of the eyes, especially on the lady characters, is the eyes are brought forward because of that thicker outline of mascara. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, I'll do the same thing with the jawline. I'll articulate that, make it appear more defined. Running my pencil around its shape. Chin around the corners of the jaw. And remember, when it comes to comic book art, you are going to be representing the human head in a stylized format. So, you know, in reality, of course, no one's chin or jawline is this sharp. You know, there's some curvaceousness always to the corners. I wish I had a chin that was this broad. Unfortunately, it's just not the reality. In fact, probably my chin would technically be more of a feminine chin if you were looking at it in a comic book context. So, yeah, comics aren't supposed to be realistic looking. They're supposed to be the ideal of really what I guess what society considers the ideal, which can always change, of course, and you'll notice that that's certainly the case throughout history. But as far as you know, how we think about especially heroic characters like Superman and Batman and whatnot, there's a general interpretation within our consciousness that we have of those heroic archetypes. It's because they are based on actual like strongman and heavyweight bodybuilders and athletes and whatnot who typically have these more chiseled looking structures to their anatomy. Okay, so that completes our male head as observed from the front view. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial and that you got a ton of value out of it. Now remember, I've got a full lesson over on howtodrawcomics.net and Skillshare that'll take you through the process of drawing both the male and female head from the front, side, and 3/4 views. So if you want to delve deeper on this topic, then I highly suggest you check that lesson out. Alright, that's it from me today. Until next time, keep drawing.